My name is Jeff Heslop, and I work at GE Aircraft Engines here in Cincinnati. And I have the honor to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Gipsie Ranney. Dr. Ranney is an experienced consultant in quality and productivity management, working with organizations such as the OQPF here locally and with such companies as General Motors. Dr. Ranney often helps Dr. Deming with his 4-day seminars, which indicates Dr. Deming's high regard for her knowledge and abilities. She is a bit of an expert in Dr. Deming's theory of management. And Dr. Ranney has her PhD in statistics from North Carolina State University and is also presently an adjunct associate professor of statistics at the University of Tennessee. Now, in regard to our topic, let me ask you this question. Has the following ever been your experience? You have just returned to your workplace from a Deming user group meeting such as this, or from reading a book or something like Out of the Crisis. You're anxious to put your new knowledge and theories to work. So you speak to someone about trying to understand the system of production, about how improved quality leads to greater productivity and higher profits. You speak to them about the need to optimize the system so everybody wins, and about how the greatest losses cannot be measured, yet they must be managed. Well, there are several responses you might get to this new theory. I'll give you the polite response first here. Someone may say to you, well, it seems like you've learned some interesting things, but we'd better get back to our jobs now. That's the polite response. Now there's the more aggressive rejection of your theories, such as we are here to make money, not philosophize. And then there's the flat-out hateful rejection of your message, especially if you're a consultant, which is, why don't you get a real job? So, has this ever been your experience? You think about these responses. Each one of these responses comes from a belief that theory is somehow impractical. We are a very pragmatic society. We seem to believe that our present business practices are not based on any theory at all, because we only work in the real world. Well, are there any theories behind our present business practices? If there are, would it be beneficial to know what these theories are, so then we could compare them with other theories, such as Dr. Deming's? Well, Dr. Ranney will provide some answers to these questions and a lot more, I'm sure, and I really look forward to this presentation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gipsie Ranney.
Thanks, Jeff. Before I get started here, I was thinking this morning about what a wonderful experience it is to come to this conference, because I get the opportunity to learn from a lot of different folks. Are we okay? Are you okay? Okay. And all of you do, and also I get to see an awful lot of old friends. The networking and perhaps the sanity check that comes with this is good. If you're like me and you're out there by yourself operating, sometimes you start to wonder if you have gone over the edge. So it's nice to come back and meet with like-minded people and share ideas and learn from each other. So I think this conference is a highlight of my year, to come here and see all of you. Jeff has given a great introduction to what I'm going to talk about. When communities of colleagues come together, or at least used to come together, to share ideas and thinking, the intent was to learn, of course, and to get from colleagues criticism, constructive criticism, and commentary, feedback. So I'm going to share with you some thinking of mine. It's not, I hope it's not solidified or become concrete yet. And it's my view of things. I hope it's helpful for you, and that's the intention, to try to share some ideas that are helpful and also to get some feedback. The title of the talk is Some Theories in Use, and of course you're all aware that the theory for management of systems that I've been working hard to learn about for several years is Dr. Deming's theory, and specifically the system of profound knowledge, which is I think an internally consistent and coherent theory for the practice of management, forms the basis of the practice of management. But that view is not shared by everybody, of course. I've heard the why don't you go get a real job kind of implication before myself. And just as a little bit of further background, I'll tell you about how I began thinking about this topic of some theories in use. I was in a meeting of executives in a company, and during the discussion, I said I referred to Deming's theory in some way or other. And an executive who was sitting next to me turned and said, "Well, that's only theory. That has nothing to do with us." And since part of my job was to try to help folks in that organization learn the ideas and the theory that Deming is teaching all of us, I was pretty concerned about that. That's only theory. That's something that those in the ivory towers do. Here we are in the real world, and we have real stuff to do, so we can't concern ourselves with that. The implication, we're practical men. Theory is impractical. And then a couple of years ago, I came across this quotation thanks to a colleague of mine at the University of Tennessee named Bill Cole, from Keynes, an economist, as you know. The ideas of economists, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Well, I think Keynes was thinking along the same lines as I was when I began thinking about doing this talk. These practical people, all of us, are operating, doing things, acting, making decisions, planning, or attempting to. And in doing that, often we don't recognize that what we do and how we think about current actions and current decisions is a manifestation of a way of thinking, some theory. It may not be clearly articulated, but it's there. And Mike Twitty referred in his talk last hour to the P word, paradigm. There is one that underlies the thought processes that we use to plan and to act and decide on a daily basis. So I thought, well, if I could figure out what that was, or what the theories were that people were actually using, if I could just articulate to them what their theory might be, or a theory that might explain their actions, then I could show some of the difficulties with those theories, show that they're not necessarily internally consistent. And perhaps as a result, I could help them change. Now, some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about in the next hour It's kind of elevating to an exalted level something and calling it a theory that might better be described as a myth. In our culture, we have lots of fairly disconnected myths that we operate with, and they're a deep part of our culture. In terms of culture, I found this triangle that was developed by two colleagues at Tennessee that attempts to describe some thinking of Edgar Schein to be pretty helpful. They talk about 3 levels of organizational culture. The first level being artifacts, that's products and behaviors that we can readily observe, but it's very difficult to interpret those. A second, deeper level consists of values and beliefs. These are not directly observable, but they can be distilled from how people explain and justify what they do. Now, I would point out there that that's not espoused values and beliefs, but real values and beliefs. What people value in an organization, what their ethical structure is, and so on. And underlying those 2 levels is what Schein refers to as underlying assumptions. The foundation of culture, which is so widely shared that people are largely unaware of them. And I think theories in use, some of the theories that we use on a daily basis, lie at that very deep level. We don't think about them. We don't recognize often that we're operating from some kind of a theoretical construct. We don't examine that or question it for its consistency with other kinds of theories that we might use. In terms of our culture at large, think about it a bit. We, I think, have a myth here that monopolies are always bad. Without question, uniformly, all monopolies are bad. And you know what Dr. Deming has had to say on that subject before. But we don't think about the monopolies that exist around us. What do they call it now? The Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Regional Intergalactic Airport across the river over there. Is that not a monopoly? It surely is. And I sure would hate to think about what would happen to the risk of disaster if there were not a monopoly in terms of regional or municipal airports. Suppose every airline set up its own airport and we were trying to thread our way through all of that mess up in the sky. I hate to think about what the consequences might be. There are other examples. Well, that's a myth, I think, that we deal with on a broad cultural level, that monopolies are always bad uniformly. But we don't think about some of the examples that are examples of useful and appropriate monopolies. Another one, competition always creates excellence and gives best results. Of course, we're in the throes of the Olympics syndrome right now, and it's wonderful to watch those kids do what they do in playing various games and excelling in various sports. However, is that always the case? And I think Alfie Conwell will have quite a bit to say about that this afternoon. An existing example in the business world, if you think of it, some 30 years ago, the big three and some other smaller ones here in the U.S. had a virtual monopoly collectively in terms of the automotive industry and the market. They were in competition with one another. Now ask the question, did that create excellence? It would seem that recent experience would indicate that no, that didn't lead to that kind of result. Excellence is not the inevitable result of competition. Maybe something quite different from that. Another one that we heard about yesterday, grades and performance ratings create motivation. Well, if you read Hertzberg and you listen to Dr. Deming, I think you would question that statement. Well, those are myths that have existed around us, or perhaps large national theories and use that we don't question. They are very deep, and it creates a very emotional reaction when somebody challenges those. I was pretty impressed 2 or 3 years ago when somebody brought up this issue of competition and monopolies and so on, and Barb Lawton said competition and cooperation are two different processes. Different contexts may call for different processes. And I was pretty impressed by hearing that. We tend to want to uniformly apply, use a one-size-fits-all kind of an idea, and not question the circumstances under which various theories that we might have might be appropriate or not appropriate. Now, from a theoretical point of view, of course, I'm going to be referencing Deming's system of profound knowledge, consisting of 4 interrelated, interdependent components: appreciation for a system, theory of variation, theory of knowledge, and psychology. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on that first piece, appreciation for a system. But I think some of the elements, the other elements of the system of profound knowledge, will show up in some of the things I'll say. So in terms of systems, if we look at organizations as systems, or in general, think about what systems are, we might go to a definition that I suspect I pirated from Bertalanffy, who's the author of General System Theory, that defines systems in very general terms by saying any complex of interrelated elements or parts is a system. Some of those are very large, very complex, some are very simple. One of the ideas that comes out of general system theory, and of course shows up in Dr. Deming's thinking about appreciation for a system, is that when there are interactions among the parts, then the whole can't be successfully understood or managed for optimization by simply understanding and managing the parts. The relationships, the interactions amongst the parts must also be understood and managed. And I think the whole must also be understood as maybe something different from just the collection of the parts. A colleague of mine down in Tennessee by the name of Bill Parr does teaching and sessions for executives, and I've watched him use a very powerful illustration in those. He brings into the room a Nerf ball. You know what a Nerf ball is, spongy ball, and a big pair of scissors. And first he asks the participants in the room, what kind of characteristics does this Nerf ball have? And they, of course, agree that it rolls and it bounces and it has other characteristics. Then he takes the scissors and he cuts the Nerf ball up into pieces. And he goes around to each executive and hands him a piece, him or her a piece, and says, here, you manage this piece and you improve this piece. And the conversation goes on, and finally we recognize that if we go off independently and try to improve each piece, that when we try to put them together again, they may not even look like a Nerf ball. They may not, the pieces put together may not have the characteristics of the system, of the whole. And that model or that example is a good one, I think, to help people begin to understand some of the ideas that we've been working with in trying to manage systems that come from the viewpoint that if you add up the parts, you get the whole. And that's not necessarily the case. Now, in addition, or along those lines, the benefit or the contribution of any element or part of a system depends upon how it affects and is affected by other related elements. This is still background material to look at some theories in use. Some ideas about organizational results. Results on various dimensions of performance, business performance, are mutually dependent upon the system that generates them and the environment within which the system operates. And I'll just sketch here for a minute a drawing that you ought to recognize. Deming's sketch of production viewed as a system. I haven't put all the labels on there. But an idea that I think Mike Twitty and Tom Nolan have collectively taught me is that if you look at that system and then you look at various results like quality, cost, delivery, whatever you might think are important indicators of organizational health, that this system generates that whole collection of results, and they're mutually dependent and dependent upon the system that generates them. So if you go and try to separate one of these particular kinds of results out and work on that without working on the system that generates the whole, you may get some surprising consequences. That's what Dr. Deming refers to as management by result. Taking various dimensions and trying to operate on them as if they were independent. And another point about systems is that there is a time dimension. Systems evolve and operate through time. The conditions in which they operate change over time. Past actions and events have an influence on current results. That is, there are delayed effects in systems. Systems are dynamic beings, like all of us are. We're all individual systems. And the past actions that we have taken influence what we are currently. We all understand that perhaps on a personal level, but on an organizational level, sometimes you don't see that evidenced in the thinking that goes on. Now, I wanted to give you some examples and try to lay out what I believe are some of the theories in use. There are four areas here. First example comes from sales and manufacturing. The second one has to do with searching for excellence, and you see the other two there. I chose these because you can find these kinds of things that I'm going to describe going on in business organizations just about everywhere. And you can also find them going on in our culture at large. So they might be helpful as examples, and you might see similar ones in your environment. Now, this first example comes from sales and manufacturing, and I'll tell you that it's hypothetical because I had to present two different collections of results here to make the point. Suppose that there's a sales group and they have an objective. Now, what's the objective of the typical sales group in an organization? Well, somebody said meeting quotas, yes indeed, but also increase sales. Increase sales. We want to see those, we want to get better, don't we? We want to see sales revenue go up. Well, that's in the new way of thinking, and I'm talking more in the typical way of thinking. So suppose you had a sales group and they did have the objective of increasing sales revenue. And of course that's in the immediate near future time frame. Not much thought about the long term, but what happens in the near term. Now suppose you had a situation like this, and what I've done here is to show a run chart or a time series of what might be the demand for a product or a service if there were no intervention on the part of the sales group. Now you might look at that picture and describe it this way, that demand for that product or service is steady, stable, even stagnant. That might be a stagnant market that we were looking at there. And these individual points could be results in terms of demand, what demand could actually be seen for weeks or months or whatever time unit that you wanted to think about there. Now, because the sales group has the objective of increasing sales, they look at perhaps these first few results that I pictured here. And what do? They've got to make sales go up. So what do? Promotions. You see them everywhere, don't you? The airlines are having promotions. Automobile manufacturers stage promotions and so on. Now, some of those make some sense because they're trying to level the demand pattern when it's seasonal. But in other cases, the effect of that may look like this second chart that I've shown here, that sales go up temporarily, but the demand is relatively constant. So when that demand gets taken care of, then sales drop below what they would have been. So you see increased variation in the actual demand pattern seen, or the sales of the product or service that you see. Now, what implications does that have for the rest of the organization? If this is a service, that means there's more variation in the capacity to deliver the service introduced by this. And that has all kinds of implications in terms of how you deal with the labor, whether you try to staff to that maximum level and try to fill up time with other kinds of activities, or whether you staff only to a low level and take on temporary people to try to service the larger demand, and then as a result of that make quality and service to the customer may suffer, and so on and so forth. This increased variation has implications for other parts of the system besides the sales group. This first came to my attention. It was brought to me in a chart by the Vice President for Manufacturing of a large company, a food manufacturing company. And their sales force would do this kind of thing for things like, let's say tomato soup or mushroom soup or some similar item that people tend to stock on the shelf and then they use it whenever they need it. And the sales group, staging promotions, was creating enormous variation in demand that the manufacturing group then had to deal with. And that led to increased levels of inventory, increased overtime, so on and so forth. Well, the theory that's going on when somebody gives the sales group the objective of increased sales, maybe some of those theories might be these. Functional activities are independent, so they can be managed independently. That is, I can go over here and give the sales group its objective, and then I can go to manufacturing and give them their objective. And those things are not related. Okay? We can manage those different units as if they were independent enterprises. Results on various dimensions of business performance are independent. What happens to manufacturing or production costs in the case of a service when you have this increased variation in demand to have to deal with? Actions directly on results, and I said here increased sales, and it may be increased sales at all costs. At all cost. Produce the intended outcome with no effect on other results, either now or in the future. Now, I would submit to you that if you take the viewpoint that Deming's system of profound knowledge is a coherent, rational, useful theory for management, then none of these things make any sense. If you look at organizations as systems, these things do not make sense. They can't be judged to be consistent with the theory that represents or a viewpoint that says an organization is a dynamic system. Now, so what I pictured here is that the actions of sales affect other parts of the organization. Manufacturing or production in general, support processes, other places in the organization. Now that old manage each function as if it were an independent enterprise comes from what I might call the accounting view of the world. The effort of the parts are additive. And if you've been to a seminar, Dr. Deming's seminar recently, if A, B, C, D, and so on are parts, then what you get as a result of the action of all of those parts is the effect of A, B, C, D, and so on, taken individually, but also the effects of the interactions. Two-way and three-way and four-way and so on. And he says the reason why these things don't add up like they're supposed to is that the interactions tend to be negative. Well, when you manage by results and try to treat each dimension as if it were independent, you have a large chance of having negative collective or interactive results. Well, here's another example. Searching for excellence. Now, I'd say that's also known as the Tom Peters syndrome. Now, what goes on there when people go out and try to find excellent organizations and then copy them? Well, they find the best, and then they see what they're doing. They attempt to identify the cause by looking at what the organization is doing, and then copy it, whatever it might be. Now, I've tried to picture then, graphically, what's going on. You look at some kind of a measure of excellence or goodness, and you look at the competitors on some scale that ranges here from worse to better, shall we say, and at a given point in time, the competitors end up arranged in this ranking here. So E has the best result, and then A, and then B, and then D, C, and F, and some of them are piled up on top of one another, so you can't see all those points there. Some forms of benchmarking are the Tom Peters syndrome at work. Yeah, the searching for excellence syndrome. Let's go find it and see if we can copy it. Now, so this is what goes on. We identify E, since it landed on top, as the excellent company. Now, what's going on? What kinds of theories are at work there? Well, current results, these, are due to current actions. Therefore, if we go now, we can see the cause. That's one of the theories. All variation is due to special causes. There's something special that we can identify about E that distinguishes it from the rest. The environment has no effect on the results. Those are three theories that might be at work there. Well, on the next page, and this is very busy and probably is an eye test up here, it's on page 10. I've tried to picture some various historical situations that could have preceded the identification of E being excellent because it ended up on top at that particular point in time. This first picture here is an illustration of the same kind of thing as what Dr. Deming is trying to demonstrate in the red beads. There, the willing workers form a system, and their ranking changes from day to day, from workload to workload, but they form a system and are subject to the set of causes that are common to all of their results. Well, this is the same kind of a thing. Stable system here. A, B, C, D, E, and F are just rearranging themselves over time, and so if we go and look at this point in time, we happen to find E is on top, but the previous year, E was near the bottom. These guys are part of a larger system, and there's no real reason why we would think that we could identify something special about E and say that's why it's the excellent company. The second case is a little different situation where E shows up on top no matter what point in time you look at. Historically, that has been E's position. Well, there might be something there to look at. But if you think about experience of some well-known companies recently, they were on top for a long time and are suffering hard times now. That's not, this even is not a prediction, not an absolute guaranteed prediction of what the future is going to look like. Conditions change and companies get caught sometimes not changing with them or predicting them appropriately. This last case is trying to illustrate that and it's like the red beads case up here, except all the organizations that are in a market are being influenced by a set of conditions that are common to all of them. You know, maybe there's a recessionary trend going on here, and then a recovery. So the point I'm trying to make there is that without knowing some history and just going and looking at one point in time and not understanding anything about the conditions that surround the situation and not understanding variation, then we could get very much misled by that search for so-called excellence. Now, there's also causal confusion in that. The causal confusion has to do with something that I've identified as carryover effects here. You see, when we take actions, there are time delays until the effects of those actions show up in the results. Today's results are connected to yesterday's causes. And so simply going and saying, well, whatever I see going on at E today is indicative of what it was that landed them on the top of the heap is pretty dangerous. There are time delays in systems. For instance, if we had adopted a new method of product design, will that show up in today's results if we just did it today? Surely not. It's going to show up in products of the future and market results of the future, not today. So causal confusion is something that often gets in our way, and the time delays in systems and the existence of common causes makes the search for excellence a very dangerous process, I think. Now, this next discussion has to do with tools, technologies, and methods, and I proposed a theory that I think I see operating a lot. And that theory is that tools, technologies, and methods have intrinsic value independent of the context of use. I'm coming to believe that none of those have intrinsic value, that the value is delivered by the context. That is how they're used. Now, let me give you some illustrations, and this first one's really absurd, but maybe it'll make the point. Some people think that technology is our solution, our savior, regardless of its use. And let's just think about a technology like electronics. And specifically, let's think about the microwave oven. Now, you want to carry this to an extreme. Think about this. Along about 1789, a microwave oven shows up in Martha Washington's kitchen. Now, do you think that microwave oven has the value or would be able to deliver the value that we think it has? Well, surely not. I mean, it might be good for a pie safe, but not for much else. Well, why not? Because the infrastructure wasn't there to support the technology. You know, there was no electricity supply to Martha's kitchen. Okay? There were no power generation stations around. There was no network of transmission of power. The equipment and the knowledge to use that for its intended use was not there. So is it always the case? Now, I know you think I'm nuts by bringing that example up, but is it always the case that a technology has value? Well, no. Not if the infrastructure is not there. Now, let's think about automation, and maybe that'll make the same point. Often people get automation in manufacturing processes anyway, and it may be true in other places, with the intent of reducing labor cost. Am I right? That's the idea. We'll automate this, we'll have less labor cost. And I went with some people one time to look at a manufacturing process, primarily assembly, that was very highly automated. In fact, they had operators stationed there, but all they did was to watch the assemblies go by. They got a lot of exercise, I guess, in their necks, but beyond that, I don't know what joy there was in that kind of a job. They just watched the stuff pass. Now, that all looks good to some people when they're really focused on how we ought to be reducing labor cost, no matter what the cost of that might be, total cost. And they forget, and in this case, I think the people that were going around looking at this forgot temporarily about all the software and the technical support and the maintenance that was required to keep that system going. Forgot about all of that. Now, the people who were showing us around reported that they had cut perhaps 700 people out of the assembly process, but then they went on to tell us about how they had to retrain those people as software developers and maintainers to support the automation system. What had happened there is that the labor cost had not gone down. It was the demographics of the labor force that had been changed by introducing that technology. New requirements for skills and background and so on. Often, we have core processes that don't work, so what we do is we surround them by various forms of insurance in order to make sure that we can make the schedule or deliver the product or whatever. And what we do by all that surrounding automation and technology and so on is that we decrease the overall reliability of the system, make it more prone to failure, and we're worse off than we were when we started. Another example of a tool that gets widely misused is SPC, quote unquote. You know, the industrial wallpaper campaigns that many of us have been through, where somebody said, the thing to do is make charts. We don't understand what they're for, or we do not have any kind of linkage of that to a learning and action for improvement process. But somebody said charts were good, so let's make them. Well, you know how wasteful that is. You see, that technology or that tool or that method, whatever you want to call it, is only useful if it's within the context of trying to learn for improvement, take action for improvement. JIT is the same kind of thing. Just recently, somebody told me there was an ad in an airline magazine for a new kind of service. It's a JIT warehousing company. Now, this is true. Now, if you can't handle, you can't manage your system so you can deliver just in time to your customer, what you can do is you can ship your inventory to them, and they'll make the shipments for you and do the paperwork. Okay? Well, Dr. Deming, on the other hand, says JIT is the just in time, is the natural result of having predictable processes. We've got our carts out in front of our horses because we tend to want to adopt technologies or tools without understanding what's needed to support them and how they might fit into an overall system of management and of improvement. Here's another one that I ran into. It had to do with a company, and the person who pointed it out to me was a financial person. They had there, at that time, a corporate accounts payable system. What would happen is that suppliers would ship in invoices, and those would be keyed into a computer, And the computer would be checking for discrepancies on those invoices, and if none were found, then it would cut a check for the payment and update records and so on and so forth. But if there was a discrepancy, it would kick the invoice out or kick a record of that out, and then somebody had to run down why the discrepancy was there. Well, at that time, a conservative estimate was that they had about $2 million a year worth of labor costs invested in running down discrepancies. Now, that's waste on a grand scale, I think. And it's a good illustration, I think, of what happens when we adopt some kind of a tool or a technology without seeing how it fits in and without paying attention to the rest of the system. This is a before picture, and I just drew this, and by the way, I won't have copies of this, but what was going on was there was this corporation, the corporate level stuff over here, and they were kind of out of the process to begin with. The divisions carried out their dealings with their suppliers, such as setting prices, communicating engineering requirements and talking back and forth about those, sending schedules to suppliers, the suppliers sending their shipments, then there's expediting that goes on, and then changes that occur to that get into the local system so that when the invoices come in and they're able to resolve at a local level any changes that might have to be made, and then the payments go out to the supplier. Now somebody said, well, look, we've got people down here doing this financial stuff, and we'd be better off if we centralize that. We'll be much more efficient as a result. Well, here is what happened. If I can find my after picture that I made. What they did was that they took the invoicing and payment part of that system, ripped it out, and put it and centralized it. And the real effect of that was that there had to be other communication channels established here in order to make changes, authorizations, schedule changes, pricing changes, so on and so forth. That information had to go into this corporate computer system in order to have these invoices not be discrepant in some way. So somebody took a piece of that system, pulled it out, treated it as if it were an independent enterprise, created the need for more complexity, and reduced the reliability of the overall system. Well, that all happened, of course, as a result of somebody saying, well, it's great stuff to centralize. See, that's a method, and we should always be trying to do that. Well, not always. Okay? Trying to do things always maybe get us into a little trouble. Benchmarking, of course, that was mentioned earlier in connection with searching for excellence. Benchmarking, if it is scanning the marketplace, trying to learn about customers' needs, how people are working to meet those needs, to learn, and then attend to what is seen externally in terms of how the parts relate to the whole and whether this would fit into my system or not, those kinds of issues, then maybe it makes sense. But the blind going to copy pieces of other people's systems and put them into place without consideration of their interrelationships and interactions with the whole is a dangerous practice. I was really almost frightened when I heard an executive who'd been to see a Japanese manufacturing facility announce gleefully that we can beat those guys because they don't have any technology that we don't have. Now, what he was able to observe was the physical manifestation of what they were doing there. He was not able to observe the theory and the principles that they operate by. And it's the part that you can't see that may make the difference. What's the aim? What's the purpose? What's the thinking? What are the theories that they operate by? Well, now this next example is relatively complex, and I'm going to try to go through it in a hurry. It's it is an example that some people have reacted to by saying, oh, that's too simple and we don't do things like that anymore. We know better. But I thought I'd share it with you because just about any manufacturing plant I can go into, I can find examples of it like this. And so maybe it's not as irrelevant as some people think. I, of course, extracted this from a real situation and made up an example that I could talk about. In one part of an assembly process, a widget and a thingamabob, after this a thing, I can't say that but once, are assembled onto a body. And they've had chronic problems with misassembly. That is, you get the wrong widget or the wrong thing attached to the wrong body, and then they have assembly problems downstream. Now that's a chronic problem, but it gets noticed when there's perhaps other fires go out and we can notice that we have misassembly problems. And when that happens, the action that typically takes place is to go and say, well, we're having this assembly problem. We'll go remind the operator of the importance of his job. Translate, re-instruct the operator. Have you ever heard that? When people talk about problems, often that's the solution. Go tell the person that what they do is important. Well, there's a theory under that, as far as I'm concerned, and the theory is the only source of mistakes is the people who make the mistakes. If that's the only thing we look at or talk to, that's a plausible theory that will lead to that action. Another action you often see, of course, is that people initiate local problem-solving efforts. And I don't mean to say by this that that's entirely wrong to do, but it's just incomplete and insufficient. Because the theories that they're operating with when this is done might be these. This problem that we see is disconnected from any other problem of a similar nature, and all causes of this problem are local and can be identified locally. Well, that's non-systemic thinking. This is really an eye test up here, but if you can refer to page 14. In this assembly process, there are 3 assemblies that are built in a mixed sequence. And the combinations, a body number, widget number, and thing number are marked there. Now you might observe the part numbers. And something that's rather interesting about them, the difference in the part numbers for widgets is only 1 digit. Notice the poetry in that. And what these guys are supposed to do in assembly is that a body comes down the line with a tag. They read the widget number from the tag. They go get a widget out of a bin. There are 3 bins lined up with, or 2 bins with widgets. They see if they can fit the widget on the body. If it doesn't fit, then they put it back in the right bin, supposedly, and then they go and get another one, except that's not a complete story. That this looks like an endless loop. If you couldn't get the things to fit, then you would get into an endless loop. But really, the line proceeds on. The body proceeds on down the line. And so there's another decision diamond in here that says time left. And if the answer to that is no, then there isn't a widget on there at the next stage. If there is time, they continue to try to find one. The same thing goes on with the thing. Well, think about errors that might occur. What if the guy can't read the widget number from the tag? Maybe it's unreadable. What if he reads the wrong number and goes to the wrong bin? What if the wrong parts are in the bin? What if the dimensions won't fit and the body goes away before he ever gets one assembled on there? What if? Well, are those things that it would be appropriate to lecture the operator about in terms of the importance of his job? Well, if you look at the sources of potential errors there, tag problems come from materials handling. Part numbers are made up in purchasing by people who don't even know anything about the assembly process or anything about pattern recognition and how that might be difficult to read those numbers and get them correct. The widgets get put in the bins by materials handling. Could be the wrong widgets put there. The dimensions that allow assembly or prevent it come from the production processes that produce those things. The line speed comes from a process design. The widget and body designs come from product design. Well, is any of that under the control of that operator? And in fact, another question, are the causes of the problems that might lead to these errors that I would submit to you are designed into that assembly system? They're not created by an operator. The opportunities for errors are designed in. Are those done locally? Well, no, they come from other systems. The effects are delayed, but the causes occur elsewhere, in product design processes, in purchasing, production, and so on. And this is an incomplete picture of the idea I was trying to convey there. Incomplete picture of whose work affects whom. The theories in use, that causes are all local and locally identifiable, and the mistakes are the entire source of mistakes is the people who make them, is faulty and flawed thinking if you think about organizations as systems. Now, in connection with that example, I thought a little bit about relationships of results here. There are two paradigms or two theories about the relationship between quality and cost that exist in the world. One of them is that as you increase quality, costs must necessarily go up. Well, that comes from reliance on inspection and local problem solving as the pure and the only means to improve quality. That implies increased cost with improved quality. But the other paradigm or theory is that as quality is improved, costs decrease. Well, that is thinking about the system at large, system improvement upstream to go to the source of the problems that we work so hard trying to solve downstream someplace, when the problems are already designed in. This is the Deming chain reaction, pictured as a functional relationship between quality and cost. At whatever level of an organization, going back to that definition of a system as a complex of interrelated or interdependent parts, at whatever level in an organization you happen to be looking, I believe there are two essentials for optimization. One of them being a statement of the aim. What's the purpose of the system? What needs are served? And secondly, an understanding of the relationships among the parts. If we treat parts as if they are independent, we're in danger, extreme danger of suboptimization. Maybe making a part look good, but the whole suffers as a result of that. These questions, I believe, are useful to ask before taking action, and this is focused on the systemic view, appreciation for a system. And it's also perhaps, these questions are also intended to try to help people get out of some of these theories in use that are non-systemic and don't recognize the interdependencies, interactions that exist. Now, when I use the term part up here, I was referring to all kinds of different parts of systems. I wasn't talking about manufactured parts. Some parts might be functions in an organization, processes, policies, objectives, methods, technologies, tools, decisions. They're all parts of some system. Well, first question, what purpose does this part serve? Some of you who are here have heard me at an OQPF dinner meeting one time talk about suggestion plans, which I believe are an example of Deming's Theorem 2, we're being ruined by best efforts. The suggestion plan, I might ask the question, what purpose does that serve? If there's no useful purpose, then eliminate it. Don't try to improve something that should be eliminated, that is poisonous to an organization. Second question, what factors external to this part influence its functioning and how? A product design process can't function well without a stable product plan. So, a stable product plan is a prerequisite for a good design process. What infrastructure is required to support this part? Now, the question there is what skills, what knowledge, what expert knowledge, what delivery systems, logistics systems, I'm using those in kind of general form, what maintenance, what communications are required to allow a tool or a technology or a method to be effective and to contribute. Those questions need to be asked. We adopt acronyms as instant pills that will make us be better. SPC, JIT, TQM, I'm afraid is in that same category in many cases. And forget about the question of infrastructure, what's required and does this contribute to the optimization of the whole? What other parts does this part influence and how? For instance, a design process has sweeping implications in terms of the ability of the production system to deliver high quality at low cost. Procurement system has heavy influence on what goes on in a production system and so on. What other parts does this part influence, be it a policy or a method or a technology or a process, and how? Well, that kind of thinking might be very helpful to us rather than simply going around searching for excellence and copying and hoping for good results. Some thinking about systems and how the pieces fit together and what the interrelationships are is pretty important, I believe, for sustainable improvement. When there are interactions among the parts, the whole cannot be successfully understood or managed for optimization by simply understanding and managing the parts. The relationships, that is the interactions, must also be understood and managed. Now, this is one version of appreciation for a system. The endless search for examples is, in my mind, an illustration of not having an appreciation for the interactions and the dynamics over time of the kinds of complex systems that we're trying to deal with and trying to manage. Unfortunately, we're not in a laboratory and we can't do nice controlled experiments. Okay? And doing causal analyses, cause and effect analyses that are really based on myths and imagining perhaps can be pretty damaging to us. We are in a situation where we have complete confounding of effects. It's very difficult to ascribe single causes to single outcomes. So be careful about that. I believe that only if you have a useful theory can you hope to plan and predict well. And I believe the system of profound knowledge is a useful theory. Internally consistent, logical, and useful for management if we wish to optimize. Well, those are just some thoughts, and I guess we have a few minutes left, don't we, Jeff, to have questions if you want to ask any questions or make comments, and I'll appreciate those. If you do that, I think we're asking that you use the microphones.
Yes. We have a microphone here in the aisle. It's been pushed over to the side here a little bit, and I have a hand mic up here I can help you with, but we have time for a few questions, and really encourage you to use these microphones here so everyone can hear. Now, here's...
The comment about systems having delays between when you take an action and the results. I find that real interesting when I start thinking about the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle and wondering about whether that really is, I hate to say this, really is consistent with that whole notion, because we can get into a lot of trouble by taking actions and then studying the results maybe too soon, when the results may take many long time, whatever.
Yeah.
Do you have a comment about that?
When you're dealing with a complex system, expecting to see the effects, immediate effects of actions that you've taken is probably a little hopeful. That one part of the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, I think, that Dr. Deming talks about over and over again, is try it out, preferably on a small scale, and use theory. We're never going to be free of theories. They form the basis for the thought processes and the paradigms that we use. So you can't expect, you know, that a single example doesn't prove a theory. I'm sure Mike was talking about that in here earlier. A counterexample may cause you to revise your theory. So if you predict results and you get something entirely different, then you've got to think about what your theory was and revise that. But simply a single trial under one set of conditions is not sufficient in the complex situations we're dealing with to say that you understand completely the cause and effect relationship. But you've learned something, you've built further knowledge or further evidence I should say. But the learning about those relationships is never going to be complete, I don't believe.
This discussion demonstrates the importance of cross-functional process planning. Unfortunately, in the large complex companies and systems that we work in, it almost necessitates division and multiple owners of cross-functional processes. In our large systems, how do we minimize this divide and conquer mentality?
In one company that I've worked with, there's a considerable amount of discussion amongst the top management group about their role as managing directors. What their purpose is, at least as they discuss it, is to look at the cross-functional nature of what they're trying to manage and make decisions and take actions jointly as a team that seek to try to optimize rather than having manufacturing go this way and engineering go that way and financial go that way and so on. So it is up to the people who own a given organization or component of an organization to seek to, first of all, see what's the purpose, what are we in business here for, what do we contribute to the whole, and what are the interrelationships amongst the activities that we're all engaged in, how do we affect each other. That's kind of a diffused answer, but there are a number of folks out there in the world that are saying that the leadership or the executives, the top in an organization, are the only ones who can work on that global optimization issue. And I think that's what Dr. Deming describes as part of the obligation of management. And so it takes some enlightenment, some understanding of systems, and so on to begin going down a path like that. It takes a long time to realize what the implications are of actions and get this systemic thinking in mind so that you operate with it day by day.
All right, we have time for maybe one more question.
No questions?
All right, well, let's thank Gipsie for her help.